On a winter afternoon in 2004, in Wichita, Kansas, a man sat at his desk in a nondescript office and watched the news play on a small television. It was one of those local crime specials, the kind stations air when they're trying to drum up ratings. The anchor's voice was upbeat, the graphics flashy. They were talking about unsolved cases from the 1970s and 80s, old murders that still haunted the city. And then they said his name. They called him BTK. Binder. Torturer. Killer. They showed crime scene photos and grainy clips of detectives from another era. They reminded viewers that he'd vanished decades earlier and, in the careful language of TV, floated the idea that he might be dead, or in prison, or living far away. What they didn't say was the truth. That BTK was watching them. That he was sitting in a chair with his work ID badge clipped to his shirt. Compliance officer, City of Park City. Listening to people speculate about whether he even existed anymore, while his co-workers shuffled down the hallway outside and his wife went about her day, both of them utterly unaware that the man behind those 3 letters was not just alive, but a few feet away from an office coffee pot. For most of his life, that was the paradox of Dennis Rader. The killer who lived next door. The man who could mow his lawn in a crisp polo shirt, wave to his neighbors, sit in the front pew of a Lutheran church, lead Boy Scouts on campouts, and then, when no one was looking, slip into a role so dark and cold it still sends a chill through Wichita's history. To really understand how he pulled that off, and how his need for attention finally became the thread that unraveled his double life, we have to go back, long before that TV special, to a chilly January morning in 1974. On January 15th, in a modest house on a quiet residential street in Wichita, the Otero family woke up like it was any other school day. Joseph and Julie, the parents, had moved their family there from the Air Force. They had 3 kids still at home, 15-year-old Charlie, 13-year-old Danny, 11-year-old Carmen, and 9-year-old Joseph Jr. called Joey. That morning, the older kids headed out for school. Chores were left undone, cereal bowls in the sink. In a normal world, by afternoon everyone would have been back, complaining about homework and arguing over the TV. Instead, sometime between 8 o'clock and 10 a.m., while most neighbors were at work, a stranger rang their doorbell. He was dressed like a repairman, carrying tools, looking tired but polite. When the door opened, he stepped inside, pulled a gun, and announced he was there to rob them. What happened next, we're not going to linger on in detail. The broad strokes are awful enough. He tied them up. He controlled them. He killed them. When the Otero's older children came home from school later that day, they found the house quiet in a way that was instantly wrong. Bedrooms, which should have been messy, were too still. Their mother didn't answer. Their father didn't shout from the garage. In the back bedroom, they found their parents. In another room, Joey. Within hours, Wichita police realized this wasn't a burglary gone wrong. Whoever had done this had taken his time. He'd cut phone lines. He'd bound the victims with different materials. He'd used the word that would follow him forever: control. For the people of Wichita, it was a horror story that landed like a meteor. The Oteros were a normal family. Their house wasn't in a dangerous neighborhood. There was no reason to think someone would choose them for anything. For Dennis Rader, it was the beginning of his secret career. At that point, in public, he was a 28-year-old married man with a background in the Air Force, a job history that included working in a grocery store and with an alarm company, and a reputation as quiet, neat, and a little boring. In private, he had already spent years nurturing violent sexual fantasies. As a boy growing up in Kansas, he'd been fascinated by images of bondage and control. He'd tortured small animals, a classic warning sign that was never fully recognized by the adults around him. He'd learned how to compartmentalize, how to tuck away the parts of himself that were unacceptable and present the parts that society rewarded: discipline, order, responsibility. He later claimed that something he called Factor X, this mix of fantasy, compulsion, and what he liked to think of as fate, pushed him from imagining harm to planning it, then acting on it. The Oteros, he said, were his chosen project. For him, victims weren't people, they were projects that he stalked, observed, and turned into plans. He'd watch houses, track routines, learn who lived where. He liked women who were home alone, but the Otero case shows how quickly things could spiral beyond what he claimed to intend once he stepped across that threshold. After the murders, police got a few early hints that the man they were looking for wasn't just a one-time offender. One clue was how prepared he seemed. He'd brought tools. He knew how to cut phone lines. He controlled not just the victims' bodies but their movements in the house, choosing where to attack. Another came later that year. In October 1974, a man called the local newspaper, the Wichita Eagle, and a station. He said there was proof related to the Otero murder hidden in a library book. Investigators rushed to find it and discovered a letter, typed and stuffed into a book on engineering. It was a taunting message. In it, the writer took responsibility for the Otero murders. He described details that hadn't been made public, complained about a lack of media attention, and suggested that he had killed before and would kill again. He also floated several possible nicknames for himself, because even his anonymity had to be branded. One of the phrases he used stood out: bind them, torture them, kill them. He liked the sound of it. BTK. That moment, the moment when the man behind the murders gave himself a name and reached out to the media, is where you see the other half of Dennis Rader's personality take over. On one hand, he was a planner. He fantasized for weeks or months. He stalked his victims. He rehearsed in his mind how he would restrain them, what he would say, what they would wear. He handled crime scenes with an almost clinical attention to detail. On the other, he needed an audience. He couldn't stand the idea that he might commit these projects in secret and have no one know how clever he thought he was. That tension, control versus recognition, is going to be what ultimately brings him down. But in 1974, he was just getting started. Less than 3 months after the Otero murders, a 21-year-old woman named Catherine Bright was attacked in her home in Wichita. She was a college student, quiet and artistic. Her brother, who sometimes came by to help her, arrived that day to find the door unlocked. Inside, he encountered a man in a room, stocky with a cold demeanor, who pulled a gun and said he was there to commit a sex crime. In the struggle that followed, both siblings were shot and stabbed. Catherine's brother survived, she didn't. Years later, in his confessions, Rader admitted he'd targeted Catherine, followed her, and broken into her home to wait. He was furious that her brother showed up, furious that the attack hadn't gone smoothly. In the rigid way he thought about his crimes, this one had gone wrong, and so he avoided writing about it in his early contact with the press, preferring to present a cleaner, more controlled image of himself. Meanwhile, on the surface, his life followed a regular track. He and his wife Paula had their first child, a son, and later a daughter. He enrolled at Wichita State University, eventually earning a degree in criminal justice. Imagine that for a second, a serial killer, sitting in lecture halls listening to professors talk about law enforcement, evidence, and criminal behavior. He worked for a home security company, entering people's houses, advising them on locks and alarms. The irony there is almost too obvious to say out loud. Then, in the late 1970s, he took a job as a compliance officer, essentially a dog catcher and code enforcer, for Park City, a small municipality near Wichita. Residents knew him as the guy who measured their lawns to see if grass was too high, wrote them up for having stray cars, and impounded their pets if they ran loose. Some people remember him as fair but strict. Others remember him as petty, someone who seemed to relish the little bit of power that came with the job. That's the version of Dennis Rader his co-workers and neighbors saw, the petty rule follower, the man who wrote meticulous reports about weeds and barking dogs. The version his family saw at home was similar, a dad who took his kids camping, taught his son about knots and outdoor skills, sat in his recliner watching TV, went to ball games and school events. The version his church saw was even more upstanding. Rader was an active member of Christ Lutheran Church. He sang in the choir. He eventually became president of the church council. He helped plan potlucks and oversaw property issues, bringing the same controlling energy he brought to his job and his crimes. When parishioners later learned who he really was, many said the same thing. He was always so normal. Maybe a little uptight, but normal. That's part of what makes this case so unsettling. There was no haunted look, no cartoonish villain vibe. He didn't live in an abandoned house or keep to himself in a way that screamed monster. He was the guy next door who told you to bring your trash cans in on time and asked how your kids were doing in school. And during those years, he kept killing. In March 1977, a 24-year-old woman named Shirley Vian was at home with her 3 children when a stranger forced his way in. He claimed he had a sexual problem and needed to tie her up. He put the kids in the bathroom with toys to keep them occupied, then bound and killed their mother. Later that year in December, he broke into the duplex of 25-year-old Nancy Fox, waited for her to come home, confronted her, tied her, and killed her. The next day, he called 911 from a pay phone, gave directions to her apartment, and told the dispatcher they'd find a homicide there. Again, he couldn't resist staging the narrative. Soon after, the local TV station Cake received a poem and a letter. The poem was about Nancy Fox. The letter claimed credit not just for her murder but for others. In that letter, Rader fully leaned into his chosen name. He explained that he'd be known as BTK, bind, torture, kill, and that he saw himself in the lineage of other famous killers. He compared himself to Jack the Ripper and the Son of Sam. He framed his crimes as a kind of dark vocation. He wanted the media to talk about him, and he wanted the people of Wichita to be afraid. It worked. For families in Wichita, especially women living alone, the late 1970s and early 80s became a time of constant small adjustments. People checked their locks twice. They slept with lights on. They watched for strange cars. They looked out their windows at 2 a.m. and imagined someone out there looking back. Parents told their kids to be careful. Hardware stores sold more deadbolts. Women asked co-workers to walk them to their cars after dark. And then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, BTK seemed to vanish. After Nancy Fox in 1977, there were no more murders clearly tied to him for years. The rumor mill offered theories. He was dead, in prison, moved away, reformed. Behind the scenes, in the 1980s, there were still cases that would later be linked to him, but at the time, police weren't sure what they were dealing with. In April 1985, 53-year-old Maureen Hedge, a neighbor of Rader's in Park City, disappeared from her home. Her car was found abandoned. She was later discovered dead in a ditch. At the time, the case didn't scream BTK to investigators. The killing seemed less staged, the circumstances different. It looked, to some, more like a one-off. In September 1986, 28-year-old Vicki Wegerle was attacked in her home. Her husband came home to find her strangled in their bedroom and their car gone. He grabbed the phone to call for an ambulance. When police arrived, they initially focused on him. Statistically, that's where these cases usually lead. They had no idea that years later, a photograph of Vicki, clearly taken by her killer as she lay dying, would show up in an envelope from BTK. Finally, in January 1991, 62-year-old Dolores Davis disappeared from her isolated home. Her body was later found under a bridge outside town. Once again, the case felt like it might be related, but lacked the kind of direct claim BTK had made in the 70s. Through all of this, Rader's public life moved forward. He continued to work. He coached his son's Scouts troop. He wrote reports for the city. He attended church meetings. He watched his daughter grow up and go off to college. He took family photos and went on vacations. At one point, he was even photographed sleeping peacefully in a recliner, a half-read book on his chest. A domestic picture so mundane it's almost shocking to know that behind it was a man who had killed at least 10 people. Inside his head, he had a different narrative. He kept detailed notes on his projects, timelines, fantasies, sketches. He stored mementos from his crimes, jewelry, clothing, ID cards. He considered himself an expert in what he was doing, using words like serial killer, not as an accusation but as a title. And yet, as the 1990s closed, he also felt something else, a creeping worry that his career would be forgotten. When you look at his letters and statements, one thing becomes clear. He was terrified of fading away. In his mind, he'd done all this work, all this planning and stalking and hurting, and the idea that he might simply be a cold case file in some dusty drawer was unbearable. So when media coverage in the early 2000s started referring to BTK in the past tense, as a mystery that might never be solved, he made a choice. He decided to come back. In March 2004, the Wichita Eagle ran a story marking the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders. The article asked what had happened to BTK and whether he'd ever be found. For Rader, reading that was like someone poking a bruise. A few months later, an envelope arrived at a local TV station. Inside were photocopies of old photographs and a typed letter. The sender claimed to be BTK. He referenced details of the Otero crime, including a description of a toy that had been moved at the scene. At first, detectives weren't sure if it was a hoax. Anyone could write a letter and claim to be a long-ago killer. But more packages followed. In one, he included a word puzzle with clues about his identity. In another, he sent a doll bound with rope and accompanied by a cryptic message. He referenced the Wegerle case, enclosing that chilling photo of her in her bedroom, proving he was the attacker. For law enforcement, it was a nightmare and an opportunity. They knew they were dealing with the real BTK now. They also knew that communication was a double-edged sword. Every package was a risk. He might escalate, he might trigger copycats, but every package was also a chance. Because no matter how careful you are, when you send physical evidence through the mail, you leave a trace. The Wichita police, now working alongside the FBI and state investigators, formed a dedicated task force. They collected every envelope, every piece of tape, every stamp. They looked for DNA, handwriting quirks, printer markings, linguistic patterns. They also studied him. His letters were full of misspellings, but the errors were oddly consistent, suggesting they were deliberate, a mask to make himself seem less educated than he was. He used formal, sometimes archaic phrases, and he referenced old TV shows and news articles in a way that suggested a middle-aged man, not a teenager. He talked about himself in the third person sometimes, as if he were narrating his own documentary. He asked for media attention. At one point, he communicated directly with police by putting a message inside a cereal box and leaving it in a stranger's pickup truck, then calling it in from a pay phone. He posed a question. If he sent them a computer floppy disk, could it be traced back to him, or would the police be honest and say if they'd looked at it? It was a peak BTK moment, arrogant, needy, and completely misreading his opponent. He wanted to keep up with the times. Other killers had email. Other killers taunted police with digital tricks. He wanted to be seen as current tech-savvy, still in the game. So when the task force publicly replied through the local media, saying that a floppy disk would be safe and couldn't be traced, he believed them. They were lying. In early 2005, a package arrived at a Wichita TV station containing a purple 1.44 megabytes floppy disk. It held a single file, a Word document. The text was a message from Beat K, full of his usual rambling thoughts and demands. For the digital forensics team, it might as well have been a treasure chest. Documents like that carry metadata, hidden information about when and where they were created, what software was used, sometimes even which registered user's name is associated with the program. When investigators examined the file, they saw exactly what they'd hoped for. The document had been created using a version of Microsoft Word registered to Christ Lutheran Church. There was also a reference to a user named Dennis. That narrowed the field dramatically. Wichita is not New York. There are a finite number of Lutheran churches, each with a relatively small membership. Christ Lutheran was a modest congregation on the city's east side. Detectives pulled church records and quickly found what they were looking for. A Dennis Rader, president of the church council, lived in nearby Park City. When they checked his address, something else jumped out. It matched the general area where some of BTK's communications had been postmarked. When they looked at his work history and background, more pieces fell into place. Military service, work with an alarm company, compliance officer, scout leader, criminal justice degree. And then, chillingly, when they looked at a map of Wichita with BTK crime scenes marked, they saw a pattern. Many of them were clustered in areas where Rader had worked or lived. Circumstantial, yes, but convincing. What they needed now was something harder, physical evidence. They began quiet surveillance, following him, watching his routines, tracking his car. They also looked for ways to get a DNA sample without tipping him off. At the time, they had a partial DNA profile from one of the crime scenes, enough to compare to a suspect's DNA, but not enough to run through databases and get a clean hit. Rader himself was cautious. As a council president and city employee, he knew not to leave cups or cigarettes lying around in public places if he suspected he was under scrutiny. He kept to his routines. So detectives went another route. They got a warrant to access medical records from his adult daughter, Carrie. She had had a routine medical procedure done that involved genetic material. Investigators obtained a sample from that file and compared it to the crime scene DNA. The result wasn't a perfect match. It wouldn't be, because it was from a close relative, but it was close enough to indicate that the crime scene DNA came from her biological father. That was the break they needed. On February 25, 2005, undercover officers tailed Dennis Rader as he drove away from his job at the compliance office. They watched him turn into a shopping center parking lot in Wichita. When he stopped, several unmarked vehicles surrounded his car. Officers approached with weapons drawn, but kept the tone calm. "Mr. Rader," one said, "do you know why we're talking to you?" Rader looked at them, blinked, and said something like, "Oh, I have a suspicion." They took him into custody and brought him to police headquarters. Inside an interview room, Detective Ken Landwehr and others sat down with him, carefully laying out what they knew. Rader tried to play dumb at first, asking questions, denying, suggesting they had the wrong guy. Then, When they mentioned the floppy disk and the church metadata, something in him seemed to shift. He realized he'd been outplayed. From that point, the case took on a surreal quality. Rather than lawyering up and shutting down, Rader began to talk. He talked for hours. He described his crimes in a cold, detached way, as if he were gearing up to give a PowerPoint presentation. He referred to murders as hits or projects. He spelled out how he'd picked victims, calling it stalking and trolling. He showed almost no empathy. When he did express emotion, it was often frustration about things that hadn't gone according to plan, not remorse. He confirmed what investigators had suspected, that he was responsible for 10 murders between 1974 and 1991. The Oteros, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicky Wegrel, and Dolores Davis, plus attacks he considered but never completed. He described driving around neighborhoods, watching women through windows, studying their routines, fantasizing about how he'd control them. He talked about hiding in closets, waiting for people to come home. He admitted cutting phone lines, bringing hit kits with ropes and tape, and sometimes taking items from scenes as souvenirs. He even talked about how he'd balanced his crimes with his family life, mentioning times when he'd committed a murder and then gone straight to a scouts meeting, or returned home to have dinner with his wife and children. That compartmentalization, this ability to wall off his BTK persona from his Dennis persona, is one of the most chilling aspects of his psychology. Most of us, when we do something wrong, feel some kind of internal friction. We replay it in our minds. We carry it around. Rader seemed able to snap in and out of roles with almost mechanical ease. At home, he was Dad. At church, he was Deacon Rader. On the street, he was the guy writing you a ticket for your dog. And in his fantasies, he was BTK. His capture shook Wichita in a way that went beyond the usual reaction to a big arrest. People stood on sidewalks and watched the news vans roll by. They drove past his house in Park City, looking at the modest brown home with its well-kept lawn and American flag. There was disbelief, but also a kind of horrified recognition. He came to our block party. He checked my yard for code violations. He sat 2 pews ahead of us in church. He was my scout leader. Journalists descended on Christ Lutheran Church, filming the sign out front. They interviewed parishioners who struggled to reconcile the man who had once handed out bulletins with the man described in the charging documents. We talk about the mask of normalcy with some serial killers. With Rader, it wasn't just a mask, it was an entire costume closet. In 2005, he pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. Kansas at that time did not have the death penalty available for crimes committed before its reinstatement, so the maximum he faced was life in prison. At his sentencing hearing, he gave a detailed, almost clinical narrative of each killing, as if he were reading from a textbook. Families of the victims sat in the courtroom, listening to him dissect their loved ones' last moments with the same tone he might use to describe fixing a lawnmower. Some cried. Some stared straight ahead. One family member later said it was like listening to a robot. The judge sentenced him to 10 consecutive life terms. He was sent to a maximum security prison in Kansas, where he remains. Over the years, true crime authors, psychologists, and journalists have tried to make sense of him. Was he a psychopath? Almost certainly. He showed extreme lack of empathy, superficial charm, and a chilling ability to lie and manipulate. Was he also something else? He wasn't chaotic like some offenders. He wasn't driven by random impulse alone. He was organized, deliberate, and extremely concerned with his image. He loved rules, city codes, church bylaws, scout procedures, and he loved breaking them in secret. There's a pattern there. People who crave control sometimes seek it in both directions, by enforcing order and by creating chaos they alone can manage. His need for recognition is another key piece. For 25 years, he might have gotten away with his crimes entirely. DNA testing at the time of his arrest was advancing quickly, but without him sending new material, the case might have remained cold for decades. It was his ego that brought him down. He couldn't bear being forgotten. He needed to see his name, BTK, in newspapers and on TV. He wanted books, documentaries, maybe even movies. He wanted to be in the pantheon of famous killers, and in reaching for that, he reached too far. It's a dark lesson for people who investigate these kinds of crimes. Sometimes patience pays off, because the offender's own psychology will trip them up. But it's also a sobering reminder of something else. Most of Dennis Rader's life was ordinary. He paid taxes. He sat in traffic. He went to church. He argued with his wife over little things. He disciplined his kids. He carried groceries in from the car. If you're listening to this and thinking, I'd like to believe I could spot someone like that, that's a very human reaction. We want monsters to look like monsters. We want evil to wear a visible uniform. Cases like BTK's force us to confront a harsher reality. Some of the worst harm humans inflict is done by people whose public selves look completely normal. That doesn't mean your neighbor is secretly a murderer. It does mean that normal isn't the same as safe. It means we can't always trust our snap judgments about who is harmless and who isn't. It also raises hard questions about oversight. Could someone have caught him sooner? Maybe. When he worked for the alarm company, he had access to people's homes and security routines. Were there complaints that should have been looked at more closely? As a compliance officer, he had a reputation in some circles for overreach. Did anyone see that as a red flag beyond annoying bureaucrat? At church and in Scouts, he was deeply involved with kids and families. We don't have evidence he abused children physically, but the idea that a man capable of such cruelty could also be in those positions makes communities reconsider who they put in authority. From a policing standpoint, the BTK case is often cited in training now, not just for how he was caught, but for how the investigation was sustained. Multiple generations of detectives worked on it. When one retired, another picked up the file. They preserved evidence that seemed useless in the 1970s, but turned out to be vital decades later. And when BTK's letters returned, they didn't rush onto TV to show all their cards. They played the long game. They let him feel comfortable. They answered his question about the floppy disk dishonestly because they knew that public safety and justice for the victims outweighed any obligation to be truthful with a man who had bound, tortured, and killed people for his own gratification. If you're hearing this story for the first time, you might be wondering, how do the people who lived through this, especially in Wichita, carry it now? For some, the arrest and conviction brought a measure of closure. There is a name, a face, a man in a cell. There was no trial spectacle, no plea of innocence. He admitted what he did. For others, closure is too strong a word. The families still live with empty chairs at dinner tables and photos of people frozen in the 1970s and 80s. When they see Rader's name in the news, usually because he's complaining about prison conditions or writing letters, they feel that old anger rise up. For the city, BTK is a ghost in the civic memory. You can drive past some of the houses where he struck. Most are occupied by families who were not even alive when the murders happened. Kids play in those yards. New mailboxes stand where old ones once held letters from him. Life goes on. But for the people who remember, those addresses are landmarks in a different map, one of fear, loss, and a peculiar kind of betrayal. The betrayal of realizing that the man measuring your fence for code compliance and telling you to leash your dog was, at the same time, replaying in his mind how he'd tied up a 9-year-old boy and his parents 30 years earlier. True crime often gravitates toward open mysteries, the whodunits, the missing persons, the cases that might still be solved. BTK's story is the opposite. We know who. We know what. We know how. What we wrestle with now is the why. Why does someone with a stable job, a family, a position in a church, and what the world would call a normal life choose to do something like this? There's no answer that will make it make sense. Psychologists talk about combinations of factors: genetic predisposition to psychopathy, early childhood trauma, fantasy life, opportunity, lack of empathy, reinforcement of deviant behavior. You can put those pieces on a chart and show how they stack. But at the end of the day, there's a gap between those risk factors and the line he crossed. Most people with rough childhoods, or violent fantasies, or access to vulnerable people, do not become serial killers. Dennis Rader did. And the fact that he walked unnoticed among the people in his community for 30 years is the part of this story that lodges under your skin. If you're listening to this in Kansas, maybe BTK has always been one of those stories in the background of your life, something your parents talked about, a name you've seen on the news, a reminder that horror doesn't always happen somewhere else. If you're listening from somewhere else, this case still has something to say. About the dangers of underestimating how far someone will go to feed their ego. About the importance of preserving evidence, even when it feels like a long shot. About the need to scrutinize people in positions of minor power, those who live to enforce tiny rules. Not because they're all dangerous, but because that flavor of control can sometimes point to deeper issues. And about how the thing that makes someone terrifying, their ability to hide in plain sight, can also be their downfall when they can't resist stepping into the light. The last time Dennis Rader truly enjoyed anonymity was probably that moment before the TV special in 2004, when he was just another middle-aged man in a city job, blending into the background. He could have stayed there. He could have taken his secret to the grave. Instead, he reached for notoriety. He mailed letters. He posed his questions. He slid that purple floppy disk into a padded envelope and sent it off, confident that he was smarter than the cops, smarter than the FBI, smarter than anyone who might try to find him. He thought he was untouchable. And in the end, that belief, that deep, delusional confidence, was exactly what put his name, not his initials, on a prison cell door. If you have thoughts about this case, about what it means for how we see the people around us, or what you think ultimately drove him, feel free to share them. Just remember, behind every acronym like Beat K are real human beings whose lives were stolen, and families who never get to stop living with what he did. The headlines will always focus on the killer. But the story that really matters lives in the homes he invaded, in the generations shaped by that violence, and in the quiet decisions communities make about how to watch out for each other after the sirens have faded. In Wichita, a man who once walked into churches and scout meetings now wakes up every day to the same concrete walls. He still writes, still organizes, still tries to control the narrative. But outside, in the neighborhoods where he once hunted, kids ride their bikes down streets he used to troll in his car. Dogs run in yards he once measured for code violations. People lock their doors at night, yes, but they also sit on their porches in the summer and talk to each other. Life slowly and stubbornly moves on. And BTK, the killer who lived next door, stays where he should have been years earlier. Behind a door that only opens from the outside.